very much. What a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. So I think we can all agree that America has some really big problems. Mine is just making the slides advance. That's my main problem. My talk is why civilized people undermine civilization. Maybe I don't have the right remote. Yeah? The number of Americans dying every year from drug poisonings or drug overdoses has gone from 20,000 in the year 2000 to over 112,000 last year. That's a 50% larger increase than the total Americans who died in the Vietnam War. The number of people crossing our border illegally has quadrupled since 2020. And the percentage of students who are chronically absent from school rose from 15 to 25% between 2019 and last year. In the big states of California, Florida, and New York, it's 30% or higher. Now, all of these problems may seem unrelated. The increase of drug deaths has its roots in the opioid crisis. The increase of student absences is related to lockdowns during COVID. And you start to wonder, well, maybe these are just disconnected problems. But from another point of view, each of these problems results in not enforcing basic laws, whether against illegal drug use or drug dealing, against border enforcement, or against student truancy. And the reason for that is because as a society, we've decided that it's cruel to enforce these laws. It's cruel to crack down on people that are coming here to seek asylum or seek opportunity. It's cruel to crack down on people that are addicts and that are just trying to meet their needs. And it's cruel to try to get kids who are suffering from other problems in their home life to come into school. But from another perspective, it's much more cruel to not enforce these laws. The deaths that are occurring unnecessarily on the streets could be avoided if we intervened in people's lives. The chaos on the border has led to a very significant increase in human trafficking, including of the worst forms, along with a significant amount of chaos. And leaving kids in bad home environments can be quite awful for them and even lead to worsening violence and abuse that would normally be detected. Now, I agree that just enforcing these laws is not going to be good enough. We've got to deal with the underlying causes of the chronic student absenteeism. We've got to have a functioning mental health care system in our country so people that are suffering from substance use disorder can get the help that they need. And we need to have a proper national unity on how to deal with the issue of immigration. But not enforcing these laws means that we don't actually ever get to those solutions. And in fact, enforcing them is the first step towards getting kids back into school and getting on the right track to, addicts often require the threat of jail and of coercion in order to get clean. And we can see with the border crisis that you really need to enforce the border for legal immigration to mean anything. So it all raises this question of why did so many people decide that it was more cruel to enforce the law than to not enforce it? I think the first obvious reason is that many of the people that decided they didn't want to enforce the laws or even that we should defund law enforcement are folks from communities that don't have a significant problem with violence. Now, don't get me wrong, in my neighborhood in the Berkeley Hills, when my neighbors call 911, they expect the police to come right away. Every single officer on the beat should be at their house as soon as they call 911. But it just doesn't happen as often as it does in a high crime neighborhood. So we sort of forget the need for that kind of law enforcement. I think the other issue, though, is just that we're highly selective in how we think about these problems. The number of Black Americans who were killed by the police was about 36 in the year 2022, whereas the number was 20,000 that were killed by illegal drugs. So our priorities are warped precisely because we've come to see police as the problem, not the solution. Now, that may explain why we don't fully appreciate the police, but it also doesn't really get at the underlying change in our values. Jonathan Haidt's famous book describes how for progressives, the emphasis in terms of values has shifted towards a heavy emphasis on care and on caring. But this explanation doesn't fully then explain why would you care so disproportionately for the 36 African Americans killed by the police and not for the 20,000 that were killed by illicit drugs. To understand that, I think we have to take a look back and realize that since we were children, the entertainment media, the news media, and our history lessons have emphasized the police as sinister figures. We see the heroes of society being arrested, standing up to the police. It's constructed a sense in which law enforcement is something that's really done to oppress people rather than to keep them safe. And we've turned ourselves into heroes when you commit civil disobedience. Similarly, if you look at the shift in films over the last 30 years, really the break becomes with Unforgiven, where law enforcement and civilizing the West becomes viewed as a sinister activity, until you get to really the dark turn where police officers are almost exclusively represented as the bad guys in Hollywood movies. They're the ones chasing after fleeing slaves or feeling conflicted or guilty about having messed up a situation around mental health, as in the case of the guilty. The result is that we've constructed a cartoon picture of the world, particularly for young people, where there's basically victims and oppressors, and that means that the observer finds himself in a place of rescuer. That is the role that we are teaching everybody in societies, that we're the rescuer against law enforcement to save the victims from the evil oppressors. That's a very different story than the classical story that our civilization was based on, which is known as the hero's journey story. In the hero's journey story, everybody's life is about overcoming adversity and victimization until you reach that really dark point of personal death and start to reconstruct who you are as a person. It's a story of overcoming, the most important song of the civil rights movement being, "We shall overcome," not "we shall remain victims forever." One of my favorite, one of the most interesting parts of this is that when we think about our personal lives, when we go to therapy or do family therapy or couples therapy, many of us learn it's a much more complicated situation than that. You may be familiar with Stanley Cartman's great drama triangle, invented in 1968. The idea was that we play roles unconsciously, find ourselves in the role of the victim. I'm playing the victim in order to get something I want, or playing the persecutor in order to demand something, or playing the rescuer coming in to save things. What Cartman pointed out is that these roles shift often in an instant. Stop a man from beating his wife, and suddenly you might discover, as I did once, that you find yourself cast in the role of the persecutor. The police officer goes from somebody rescuing you to somebody that's persecuting you. This has happened at a cultural wide level, but you can see these things shift around quite a bit. Here's the point of view of a family situation for many people. Moms trying to rescue their kids. This is the point of view from the dad. Many of you might be familiar with, but of course, it can go in any direction. I could go all day with the Cartman drama triangle. And this peculiar narrowing of our roles, of wanting to play the rescuer as empowered people, has led us to overestimate our power and take on new powers that we shouldn't have. And those include powers to silence others. And so what we've seen is a huge increase of young people in particular that say that speech constitutes a kind of violence. So there's a significant amount of confusion now taking place across the Western world around speech being physical and physical acts being justified as freedom of expression. And we see this happening very dramatically here in New York at this very moment. You can see 1 out of 10 college students say that they themselves were disciplined or threatened with for things that they had said. 26% of them for things they said in their dorm rooms. So you can see that these traditional boundaries of privacy and public life have been breaking down. Now, some of this is clearly due to social media. Jonathan Haidt has convincingly showed that these big increases of anxiety, particularly among the young, really come from the period of the widespread adoption of smartphones and social media. You can also see then a desire to express our goodness as rescuers by showing awareness and sensitivity to the issues that we were trained to be sensitive and rescuing on. And you can see too here the ways that these things have had an effect mostly on progressives or liberals, or what we might call them, some of the people that identify as the most compassionate in society. But there's other trends that were going on before this that I think are just as important. One of the most significant is the declining belief in traditional religions. The result of this declining faith in traditional religions has been an increase of anxiety. And this is now held across multiple studies over time. Whether you're a person of faith or not, I think the evidence is pretty strong at this point that not having religious faith creates a lot of anxiety, including about what happens after we die. The problem of disbelieving in God is not that man ends up believing in nothing. Alas, it's much worse. He ends up believing anything. I think this is part of what we've seen here, where people start to engage in behaviors that in a previous generation would have seen not particularly humble, and behaving as in a rescuing fashion that is so intense and so inappropriate that we start to see demands for things like an increase in censorship. Shocking numbers share of Democrats in particular who say that the government should be involved in censoring speech online rose from 40 to 70% over the last 5 years. And that boundary between what is considered speech and what is considered real-world violence breaks down. So you can see folks that might strongly favor censorship of things that people say engaging in physical, intimidating behaviors like this. These are some of the people, I think that people raising their fists are probably some of the most compassionate, sensitive, and civilized people in our society, and yet who can deny the violence of this act? So where does all that leave us? I think that one of the arguments has been that we all need to return to traditional religions and find our faith. But unfortunately, that's not something that a lot of people are opting to do on their own. It's not something you can persuade people of or convince people to do. You certainly can't impose it. I think a much better place to start is the fact that civilization is clearly breaking down in some fundamental areas. I mean, this drug death crisis for me is at the top of the list, but the chaos on the border and the abandonment of 25 to 30% of our children in home environments rather than getting them in school, these are all, I think, sufficient basis for restoring some vision of society. But if you needed any better argument, if you wanted to make an argument based in care, you can do no better than what occurred after the Black Lives Matter movement promoted defund the police. There was a spike in homicides that killed at least 3,000 additional African Americans that would have died otherwise. The reason is very clear when you talk to police officers. They pulled back. They weren't out there engaging with potential murderers and victims. They weren't out there in the community. They were sort of arms crossed, resigned to pulling back, and that emboldened folks to commit the worst crime we know of. So for me, this is a wake-up call that we need to save civilization. And that means that the civilized in particular need to step up. We need to become aware of what civilization is based on, refamiliarize ourselves with its pillars, and start to defend it. I think that starts, rather than starting it in a faith, it starts it in a faith in a particular religion. I think it starts with a faith in humankind itself. That means love for humanity, whether you're atheist or Christian or Jewish or Hindu or pagan, any of those things. Let's start with a reaffirmation of what it means to be human. Those are universal rights, an appreciation of our own moral ambiguity. The line between good and evil runs through all of us, and embracing what we've known from psychology, that people need security in order to have freedom, abundance, and all the rest. I think Daryl Davis is an inspiration when it comes to free speech. He says, please allow the hate speech. If you don't allow people to express their hatred, then you can't talk back to it, you can't humanize yourself, and you can't persuade KKK members to give up their robes. I think we have to get beyond this idea that you can divide the world into victims and oppressors, and that we're in the role of rescuers. We're all capable of playing different roles on the Cartman Triangle. And we need to return to this new story of overcoming. Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement had it right. We shall overcome, including this crisis of civilization, but it means recognizing that we all suffer and that we all deal with adversity in order to achieve our maturity. Jonathan Haidt's contribution is essential. I think that when you look at those core values, that really we need to be appealing to this part of the map, to the unifying values of caring and freedom, rather than to loyalty, authority, and sanctity. This is the basis for constructing a new majority for civilization. So there's 7 pillars. If you want civilization, you just need the first 3, law and order, meritocracy, and cheap energy. But if you want a liberal democratic civilization, you also need free speech, equal justice under the law, free and fair elections, and free enterprise. There has to be that pro-human commitment affirming all of it to also reproduce the civilization. That means let's start at the top. Let's get the kids back into school. Let's reduce those numbers from 30 to 10%. That means enforcing the truancy laws, tying public school funding to student attendance, and increasing educational freedom. We got to regain security on the border. That means that we need to have a broad agreement around border security, as well as, I think, improved and increased legal immigration and incentives for having children. Drug deaths have got to peak now. This is a moral stain in our country. We need to make the intervention, and we need to have the addiction care and mental health care system that we need. Peak drug deaths right away. This should be the top priority for any presidential candidate. And a vision of positive policing. It's not good enough to just go back to that 1950s law and order style. Police officers do need to become more like social workers. That's going to require more police, more training, more sensitivity, and an ability to engage in the community and bring crime down. Thank you very much. Let's go do this. Thank you, guys. Thank you.